Welcome back, viewers, to another episode of my tutorial series, of my Python tutorial series. My name is Eliaza, and you are watching EA Lego Academy. All right, so to continue from where we left off in our previous tutorial, today we are going to be looking at nesting, what nesting is all about. But before we explain what nesting is all about, we are going to talk about nested for loops because it's our knowledge and our understanding of nested for loops that will allow us to be able to understand what nesting, the concept nesting is all about. So I'll give a brief definition of what nesting is. Then we're going to explain further, that is expand more on that definition with practicals, of course. So I will start with what nesting is. So nesting is when we embed a data structure inside another data structure. So that's the definition of nesting. So the data structure can be a list, a tuple, or a dictionary. It's when we embed one of these data structures inside another. So it can be that we are embedding a list in a list, or we are embedding a list in a tuple, or we are embedding a list in a dictionary, or we are embedding a tuple in a list, a tuple in a tuple, a tuple in a dictionary, or a dictionary in a list, a dictionary in a tuple, or a dictionary in a dictionary. So we are going to explain all these concepts properly. But before we dive into that, and before we comment, I want to plead with you guys to like this video, share it, and subscribe. But right now, you might not have a reason to do so yet because we haven't dived into the details of this video. But I hope that at the end of this video, you would have real reasons in order to like, share, and subscribe. All right, so let's dive into today's episode without further ado. Okay, so now a nested for loop, we said this is when we create a for loop inside another for loop. It is displayed below. The outside for loop runs one iteration first and waits for the inside for loop to run all its iterations before it moves to its own iteration. So I'm sure we know what iteration is when we looked at the for loop initially in our previous video in one of our episodes. We said an iteration is a single execution of a program in a loop. It can be a for loop or a while loop. So we have looked explicitly at the for loop, and we would soon dive into the while loop. So when you execute a program once, as a loop runs the first time, when we get our program executed, we can say the execution of that program is an iteration. So that's what it is. Just a quick recap. So let's dive into the details and the nuances of the code for a nested for loop. Now, you can see that I have an outside for loop here and I have a for loop within this for loop. So what is the definition that we just explained, what it's trying to say? It's trying to say that when this outside for loop executes an iteration, that is, if you look at this list, so for the first iteration for out v is 7. So while out v is 7 for the first iteration of the outside for loop, the inside for loop finishes its own iteration. So when the outside for loop runs once, this inside for loop in V, which would represent 1 for its own first iteration, would run. So it will now be out V, which is 7, 7 multiplied by in V, which is 1 for the inner for loop's first iteration. So you will now get the result of 7 times 1. Then instead of the outside for loop to start its next iteration, it would be the inner for loop that would start its next iteration. So while out V is still on 7, the inner for loop in V would now be 2. It will now be 7 times 2, we would get 14. Then the inner for loop would run its third iteration, while the outside for loop is still in its own first iteration. So you will discover that this inner for loop would iterate over from 1 down to 12 before the outside for loop would move to its own next iteration, which will be 8, and then the inner for loop would iterate again from 1 down to 12 again. I'm sure that makes some sense. So what I will do is that in order to explain this concept, you head over to your PyCharm, right click and create a new file. Just call the file nesting. You can give it any name you want, but I will call mine nesting. So nesting, now I will create two lists. So what I'm trying to do first before we start writing code, the topic, in order to explain the concepts I just talked about, I will say I'm creating a two times 3 times 4 times table up to 12 times. So I'm creating a 2 times 3 times 4 times table up to 12 times in order to explain this concept. So I will just create a list. I would call it number 1 is equal to 2, 3, 4. So this would represent the list that holds my 2 times down to 4 times. And then I will create another list called number 2. I will just make it numbers instead of number. So equal to, now this one would range from 1 down to 12. Now I will create a for loop. I'll say for number. Now I'm going to use some conditional statements. I will introduce conditional statements so that we would know when we are at 2 times, when we are at 3 times, and when we are at 4 times as well. So for number in numbers 1, now we know that we are looping through this list. So for the first iteration, just like I explained, this outside for loop would run its first iteration and wait for the nested for loop to complete its own iteration before this outside for loop can move to its next iteration, which would be 3. So I would create a conditional statement that allows me to see if I am at 2, so that I can print out a sentence that says 2 times. Then when I am now at 3, I will also create a sentence that will print out 3 times. Like that, when I am at 4, I will also create a sentence that prints out 4 times, like that. So I will create a conditional statement in order to specify that. So you can go back and look at conditional statements if you are not getting this video, but I will do my best to explain. So we have been starting step by step all through the way. So if you're having difficulty comprehending this particular thing I'm explaining, go back to my previous videos, specifically the video that talked about conditional statements, and you will understand what I'm doing here. So I will come here and create a nested for loop. I'll call it number 2, but I'll come here and change this one to number 1. So for number 2 in numbers 2, I'll come here, I'll say print. Now before I even do that, so that it can make sense. So if I discover that for the outside for loop, its first iteration is 2, I will come here and print 2 times, 2 times, or you can just say 2x. Yeah, 2x. Then I'll come here and I'll multiply the numbers. So you can use your format method or F string or C style string. If you are just jumping into this my tutorial series from this video, you might not get a full comprehension of what I'm talking about unless you visit my previous videos where I explicitly explained these terms. Okay, so you say equal to the dot format. Now I will pass the first value, number 1, which represents the first number, and then number 2, which represents the second number, and then the result, number 1 multiplied by number 2. Okay, so I think the screen is too big. So that's what you will get. So this is for the first iteration when I am at 2. Now I will create an elif condition when I am at 3. So elif number 1 is equivalent to numbers 1 at the 0 index. Sorry, at the 1 index. So to save yourself the stress, just copy the code and then paste it. I like doing that so that I can be efficient instead of wasting time and repeating some concepts. So you just come here and say 3 times. Yeah, then you get the result like that. Now, instead of wasting your time to copy the elif again, just copy this one. Or rather, instead of wasting your time to type it again from scratch, just copy and paste and then come here and change it to 4 times. So you will discover that by the time we print this out, you will get a title specifying when you are at the 2 times part, then another title specifying when you are at the 3 times, and another title specifying when you are at 4 times. So what I would do in order to make it neat, I will create a new line. I'll say print \n so that they would not be jumbled up together. I would copy this and I will paste it here also. The and that voila. So you just come here to see the result. So you will discover that we will get a proper times table. Okay, it says 2 times number. Okay, sorry, I made a mistake here. So it's number, not numbers. So that's what it was telling me. Since number 1 and number 2 represent each element at each index position, it can't be numbers. So my bad. So you want to delete it and correct it properly. So remove, since you are multiplying number, not numbers. Numbers represent the list that you are looping through, while number represents the element in that list. So now if you scroll down, you will see we get our complete multiplication times table. So you see I have 2 times first, then you see 2 times 1, 2 times 2, down to 2 times 12. And we have a new line so that it can be neat and provide order and structure to our code. We get 3 times 1, down to 3 times 12. You understand? So there's no 4 times. There's no 4 times. So you change it to the 2 index. So that was my mistake. So and you see we have 4 times as well up here. Then we have the title 4 times. So this is one way of explaining a nested for loop. So when you are embedding a loop within another loop, and the same principle applies in case I had 3 nested for loops, I will explain. So you can comment it out when you are done. Comment it out. So in case I had 3 nested for loops, like for I in range maybe 3 for come here for j in range, maybe another 3 again, then for k in range, so maybe 3. Now it's that order in which they appear as a print I, comma j, comma k. So what's happening here is that now this outside for loop, the first for loop would run a single iteration and wait. This the first nesting of the for loop, the j, would run a single iteration also and wait. Now the last for loop here would complete its iteration before j moves to its own next iteration, while I is waiting for everything to complete the iteration. So when I runs once, j runs once, k completes. As k completes, j would run its second iteration, while I would wait for j to complete its iteration before I moves to its next iteration. I hope that makes sense. So this is the principle and structure that we follow when we are trying to carry out a for loop, or when you are trying to deal with complex algorithmic problems such as matrix multiplication, creating a table. We'll get familiar with these concepts later on in the course as we try to apply what we have learned in creating desktop applications and creating a banking management system and some other complex projects as we go on in this tutorial series. So that's how nested for loop works. Now, we want to go back to the principle, or rather, we want to go back to the topic we have for today, which is nesting. So, like I said earlier, this is having a data structure inside another data structure. So the first thing we are looking at is a list in a list. So just like I said, is when we put a list inside another list. So you just head over here. So say list in list. I'll say contain one is equal to Alex, David, Brian. Then contain two is equal to Sam, Lucas, Jeff. So I will create another list called contain hold is equal to. Now this list would act as a holder for both of my lists. So it's going to treat this third list will treat the two previous lists I created as elements within itself. So I can come here, create a for loop for CONH in contain hold. Then you now come here and say for um con con el in con h. What did I do here? So what I did here was that now the for loop follows the same principle for nested for loops, whereby the outside for loop would start an iteration, then the nested for loop would complete its iteration before the outside for loop can move to its own next iteration. So for the first iteration of the outside for loop, con h is contain one, and we can see that con h for that iteration is itself a list. So that is why I decided to loop through that list, creating a nested for loop to access each element in that list. Now you will discover if I come here and say print con al, this would print out Alex, David, Brian. Now, because it follows that same principle, when the outside for loop runs an iteration and waits for the nested for loop to complete its iteration, you will discover that, having said that, when con h is equal to contain, con el would represent Alex, David, and Brian. Now, when it prints out Alex, David, and Brian, since we did not create anything that allows us or that specifies that we are done looping through that list and we are about to enter the next list, you will discover that when it prints out the result, Alex, David, and Brian, it will print them out together. Alex, David, Brian, Sam, Lucas, Jeff. They would all be in a single line because there was no new line to tell us that we are done looping through the first list that was inside contain hold before moving to contain 2. So I would explain again. For the first iteration of the outside for loop, con H is contain 1. Now, since con H is contain 1 and contain 1 is a list, con EL would represent Alex, David, and Brian for each iteration. When it gets to Brian, you can see that for that iteration, we are done. We have finished executing the nested for loop. Now, the outside for loop would now move to its own next iteration, which is contain 2, and then the nested for loop again would start again from, or would continue from Sam, Lucas, and Jeff. But because we did not specify that we are done with that first list and we are trying to enter the next list to access its elements, you will discover that they will all be joined together in a single line, vertical line. So if you run this code, you will see that you just have everything stacked upon themselves. Alex, David, Brian, Sam, Lucas, Jeff. But we want to do something whereby we would create a title first list at the top, and then there will be a new line, and then we would now have second list before we have Sam, Lucas, and Jeff. We want to separate it so that we would know that we were done with the first list before we entered the second list. So in order to do that, we are going to introduce a conditional statement. So you can come here and say if con H is equivalent to contain hold at contain hold at the 0 index, you want to, you can just come here and indent. You can indent this, and you can come down here and say elif con H equal to contain hold at the 1 index, and you can just come here and copy your code and paste it here as well. Now we're going to make a few alterations. So you come here and say print first list, so that you will know that you are looping through the first list, and then you want to create a new line so that it will not be joined together. Come here, say print backslash n, and you can come here also and say second list, and discover that they would not be joined together. The second list. So you can run that again, and you will discover that your code now has structure. You will discover that your code has more structure. So first list, Alex, David, Brian. Second list, Sam, Lucas, Jeff. So we know how conditional statements work. If you don't know, watch my previous videos and practice. So I don't want to waste time. I would not want to waste time here. So sorry for the noise. The rain is falling here. So all right, so just comment out your code when you are done. Comment it out. Let us move to the next uh, topic. So now we have list in a tuple. So it follows the same principle, the very same principle. The only difference is that I'm going to have lists in tuples. So it's still the same thing we're looking at here. You will discover that the data structure that holds those two lists is now a tuple. But if you can remember, when we talked about tuples, I said that whatever you can do with a list, you can do with a tuple apart from modifying elements in a tuple. You can't modify elements in a tuple. but you can iterate over them. You can loop through elements in the tuple. You can access an element at a specified index and use it to make a sentence. You can play around with them, but you cannot remove elements from a list. You cannot add, you cannot modify. So these are the restrictions that govern working with a tuple. So I just come here and say list in a tuple, and I'll just copy the same code without wasting our time. Copy it from here since it's the same principle that governs it as well. Copy from here down here, and then you just change a few things. So when you paste, you come here to the square bracket and change it to a parenthesis, and then you come here, change it to a parenthesis as well. So you will discover that you would have the exact same result printed out. So they are basically one and the same tuples, except for the fact that you can't modify elements in a tuple. That's the difference between a list and a tuple. All right, so you want to comment out your code when you are done. So we're just looking at nesting. That's all. That's all for this tutorial. So now the next one is list in a dictionary. So now this one is a bit complex, but not too complex. So we said that this is when we put a list in a dictionary. Now you will discover that I have two lists here and I'm embedding them as elements or as values of these keys. We know and we have explained that dictionaries are made up of key value pairs. But now we are saying here that the values of the keys are lists themselves. So in other words, if I'm accessing a key and the value pair in a dictionary and the value of that key is a list, I would also need to loop through the elements of that value of that key in order to print them out. So the value of that key is a list that has its own elements. So it would also need to be looped over so as to access its elements. I hope that makes sense. So what we are going to do here, we're going to create two lists. I'll just call it list con. One is equal to, I'll just say David, Sam, Mark, James. Now the next one would be list con 2. This one will have some numbers 25, 27, 28, 29. So now these two lists will now be elements as they will be acting as values of a key or of keys in a dictionary. So I'll call this dict con is equal to. So here I will just come here and say names. You can just come here and pass list con. Now it's not a must that you must create the list first before you use it as the value of a key. It's not a must. I'll show you. So list con 2. Now instead of me doing something like this, I can as well just write it directly 25, 27, 28. That is what I meant. I come here and write it directly also. Just copy values. So there's no need for you to actually create a variable first and then pass that variable as the values of keys, not necessarily. All right, so now I want to look through this dictionary. Now if you can remember from when we our tutorial on dictionary, the episode that we did on dictionaries, in order to access key value pairs in a dictionary, there is a function called items, which gives us the ability to access key value pairs in a dictionary. So I'm going to apply that here as well. I'll call it I, j in dict con. So I will create two variables that represent the key and values within this dictionary. I would come here and say dot items. So if you can remember, I said dot items is what gives us the ability to access key and value pairs within a dictionary. If you can remember, whereby we talked about implicit representation and explicit representation. So if you can't remember, go back to my previous video and revise. All right, so now here we can see that I represents the keys in this dictionary, names and age, and we can see that J represents the values of these keys. That is, these two lists here, J represents the both of them. So now, since we know that J in itself is a list for each iteration, it means that we would also need to loop over J as well. We would need to create a variable that represents each element in J for every iteration. Now, in order to make sure that the results are not jumbled up together so that they can be separated, just similar to when we created a list in a list and a list in a tuple, so that we can know we can know for which iteration we are currently at. We would need to introduce a conditional statement here. So I would say if I is equivalent to dict con at no, I'll say if I is, now I represents the key. So, or now since you cannot access a key directly, or we can do that actually, we can do that. So you can just come here and say names. You can either do it like this, it will still work, or you can decide to use the value of that key, which is J in this case, and say if J, I prefer to do this because it makes it fun to manipulate. So if J is equivalent to dict con at name, okay, no, let's use the I, because the reason why I can't do this is because now J has multiple elements for each iteration. So if I specify, I would not know the exact one I'm talking about. Like everything here is already at the first iteration when we loop through this dictionary. So specifying a single element at a specified index would not make any difference because this for loop is going to run twice at the end of the day. So it will be better for us to just use I instead. So I is equivalent to names. You can now come here and carry out an iteration over J. So I'll say for K in J. Now I can now come here and say now before that I will come here and say print key so that we can see the key name. So you put a dash dash at the front. So key, then I'll use my dot format. You can use your F string if you want, doesn't matter. So to print it out, then come here and say print. And you can make a sentence as well. Values, just say value, since for each iteration we are printing out a single value, not multiple values. So I just come here and say key for that iteration. So you can now come here and create. Now after that, you want to create a new line so that it will not be joined together. So print backslash n. Then after that, you can come here and create an elif. Elif I is equivalent to age. Then you come here and say print. So you can just copy the code instead of writing it again. I will just come here, copy it up to here, and then paste. All right. So now, if you run your code, you will discover that you have structure and you have order. So for the first iteration, before I run this, when I is equivalent to name, which is my key, it will print out key names. Then it will go to the next line, and then you would now see to print out David, to print out value David, value Sam, value Mark, value James, before the for loop will start its second iteration. So it's still following that same principle that the nested for loop would run first before the next iteration of the outside for loop. So after this prints out all the values for the first iteration, which are David, Sam, Mark, and James. The outside for loop would start its next iteration, whereby I would now be equal to age and J would now be equal to the second list that has the numeric values. Then you get the same result to print out key, age, then it will loop through the list and print out the numbers. Hope that makes sense. So there's no need for this new line at the end since we're not printing out another iteration. So run that again, check it, you will see that we have exactly that. So you can see that we have ordered our code. We say key, names, value David, value Sam, values Mark, value James. Then we have the next iteration for the outside for loop. We have key age, value 25. I hope that makes a lot of sense. That's just how nesting works. That's how it works. So this one was list in the dictionary, list in dictionary. And then so when you are done with this, you want to comment it out, highlight down to the very last part and comment it out. So now the next thing we would be looking at is tuple in a list. So this is just a reverse of what we did here when we said list in a tuple. So now this one is two tuples in a list. So it still follows the same ideology and the same principle as the previous code we did. So you want to scroll up and come here to list in a tuple, copy that code down. We're not wasting time. Stop here, copy up to this point. So the topic is what? So tuple in a list. So you paste it, Control V. Now, since we're looking at tuple in a list, give a topic like that. So tuple in a list. So you just change this two to parentheses. That's what you do. Change this one again to parentheses, change this one to parentheses, and come here and change this to a parenthesis. So I'm creating two tuples within a list. So you change this one to a square bracket, square bracket. You come here to change this one also to a square bracket. So I'm putting two tuples within a list and I'm performing the same operation. And as you have already figured out, we would get the same results. So we're just playing around with nesting. That's what we are doing. All right, so after that you want to comment it out. When you are done, comment it out so that we would not waste time. All right, so the next one that we will be looking at is tuple in a tuple. So still with that copied, so tuple in a tuple, still the same principle, tuple in a tuple, paste. Now after you paste, you just change this two to parentheses. That's all you do. Change them to parentheses and it will now be two tuples within a tuple itself. And if you execute this code, you would get the same result that we had. See, we have the same result. So nothing changes. It's just the data structure that is changing. And of course, we know the principles that govern a tuple and lists. So we're just adhering to those principles. All right, so the next thing that we will be looking at is tuple in a dictionary. So tuple in a dictionary also follows the same principle that we applied when we looked at list in a dictionary. So the only thing we're going to do is to change these square brackets to parentheses and run the code again. Now you can feel free to experiment further. There's no one specific way in writing code. There's no one specific way in writing code. You begin to have more knowledge as you practice and get better as a programmer. And you would be able to come up with your own ideas on how you can write a single problem in multiple ways. Sorry, how you can solve a single problem in multiple ways. So it's your experience as a programmer that would allow you to manipulate your code in order for it to do something for you. So copy this, copy it from here. I'll just copy from here down, down. So you come here, copy from here to this point. So you come here and say tuple in a dictionary. So tuple in a dictionary. All right, so now you just change this square brackets to parentheses. That's all. You run your code and you will discover that you will get the same result. So I just come here and click on play, and the same result will be printed out to you. So when you are done, just comment it out. Start from here down, comment it out. So we would look at the last part, which is a bit kind of like the most difficult, but not really. It's intuitive. You'll be able to grasp it. All right, not yet. Actually, not yet. So the next one is dictionary in a list. Not the last one, the next one. We would look at the last one very soon. So this is when we put a dictionary inside a list. So now this concept is a bit different from the ones we have talked about. Now I created two dictionaries here, and I embedded those dictionaries as elements in this list. Now for the first iteration, since I'm dealing with elements in a list, I will just create a variable that represents each element in that list. Now that variable represents my dictionary, but you will discover that when I looked through that list that had those two dictionaries, I just created a variable that represented the both of them. Now that variable represents those dictionaries, but you will discover that the first for loop on the list, there's no dot items because it is a list holding two dictionaries. It is on the second for loop that I applied my dot items on, because for the first iteration of item, when item is the first element in this list, item represented dict1. So that's why I used items on it, because it's a dictionary and items allows us to access key value pairs. That's why I created IT1 and IT2, representing the key and the value pairs within that dictionary for the first iteration. So for the first iteration, IT1 and IT2 represented name and David. So to print out name and David like that, second iteration within the nested for loop. So don't forget, the outside for loop is waiting for the nested for loop to complete its iteration before it can move to its own next iteration. So on the first iteration, when item was equal to dict1, IT1 and IT2 on its own first iteration was name and David. On its second iteration, it was age and 37. On its third iteration, it was course and physics. Before the outside for loop would now move to its next iteration, which is dict2, and then it will now repeat the same process again. But just like I explained earlier, because we did not create a conditional statement that would notify us or alert us when we are done with the first dictionary before moving to the next dictionary, you will discover that everything will be joined together in a single stack or heap. They will all be joined together. So you will need to create a condition that will specify when you are leaving that element or that dictionary to the next, so that there can be a new line and there can be order or structure in your code. So just come back here and say dictionary, dictionary in a list. I'll create two dictionaries. I would call the first data one, and this one will have own key value pair. So name will be Alex. To have another key called age. This one will be 37, and another key called course. This one will be physics. Now there would be another dictionary here, and to have its own key value pairs. So name David, to have its own age, call it 30A. Then another key and its value biology. Right, so now I'm going to put everything inside a list. I would call this list hold. I'm out of names in my head, so just alternating between these names, not really creative though. All right, so I have two lists, rather, I have two dictionaries inside a list, and I want to look through that list. So I will just say for corn in list hold. So now I'm looping through the list. Now corn represents data one. So I can create a conditional statement that if corn is equivalent to list hold at the zero index, what am I trying to do? I'll come here and carry out a for loop. I'll say for k comma v in corn dot item. So now there's structure in my code. There is structure in my code. So I will come here and say print, and you can use your string formatting to give them their names, their various names. So I'll say format key. It will print out the key for that iteration, and then you can now print out the values. Say value, just practically the same thing I did. Value, you come here, say dot format, and you put v there. All right. So you can now create another condition. Now, before you create another condition, you want to create a new line so that they will not be joined together as usual. Come down here and say elif con is equivalent to hold at the one index. So you can just come here, copy it instead of wasting your time to type it all over again. There's no point. The whole purpose of learning how to write code is to be able to learn best principles, best practice principles. So that's the whole purpose of learning how to code. So if you run your code, you will discover that we're going to get it when we left that iteration. That is when we left the first iteration for that first dictionary and we entered the next iteration for the second dictionary. So you can decide to specify them and give them a title. You can come here and say print first dictionary so that it can be clearer. Dictionary, and then you can even give it dash dash so that it will be clear. You can come here and for this elif, just come and say print the dash 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 second dictionary. All right, so now this will tell us that we are at the first and we're at the second, like that. So you will discover that for the title we get second dictionary, for this one we have first dictionary. So you can see that here we know when we are done with that iteration and we are moving to the next iteration, we're able to specify that. All right, so that's how you can create a dictionary in a list. Now, the second to the last one would be dictionary in a tuple. So it follows the same principle. I would not be writing the code. I will just copy and paste. So dictionary in the tuple. Let me confirm if I'm correct. All right, so yeah, dictionary in a tuple. That's the next topic. So to save yourself the stress, you can just come here, copy from this point down. Let's see where it stops. So you stop here, dictionary in the tuple, paste, and then you change those square brackets to parentheses. That's all. So you come here, write a parenthesis in place of the square brackets, and if you run your code, you would get the same result. You will get the same exact result. So you see that, have that printed out. Okay, so when you are done, you can just comment it down. Okay, so now the last but not the least is a dictionary in a dictionary. So this one is a bit complex, but not too complex. Okay, so we said that this is when we put a dictionary inside a dictionary. So now here I will be explaining a lot of things that I want you to understand. So here in this description, this is my note, you can see that we put two dictionaries inside a dictionary. But you will notice that the name of the first dictionary is acting as a key. And how do we know that? You can see that here. Oh boy, bear with me, that was my mistake. Quickly scroll down to ah, that was my mistake. Sorry about that. Hmm, okay. Sorry. So you will see that here, this code one is acting as a key, and we can identify that by the colon. So we can see the colon here, and then you can see a curly bracket. Of course, we know that when we see a curly bracket, we are referring to a dictionary. So now this dictionary here is now acting as the value of this key. So hold one is a key, and then the dictionary body here is the value of that key. So hold one is the name of the nested dictionary, which is a key, and then the actual dictionary itself is the value of the key. So the name of my dictionary is the key, the body of the dictionary is the value of that key. And you can see the next key here, hold two, which is the name of the next dictionary, and then the body of that dictionary name is acting as the value of that key. So having said that, you can see that I carried out my outside for loop first. The principle still holds. The principle I explained. The outside for loop would run one iteration first and then wait for the nested for loop to complete its own iteration before the outside for loop can move to its next iteration. Now, since we know that hold one is a key, the body of this dictionary is a value, hold two is the next key, and the body of this dictionary is the value of hold two, we can see that for the first iteration, first dict here represents hold one, and second dict here represents the body of hold one. We have just explained that. We have just explained that. So the body of this dictionary is the value of this key. This is a key value, key value. So they are all key value pairs, key value pairs. Now, for the first iteration, first dict is hold one, and then second dict is this body here. Now, since it's a dictionary holding everything called dict hold, that's why I'm using dot items. But don't forget, second dict is itself is a dictionary, or it represents dictionaries. So second dict represents this dictionary and this dictionary. And we can see that they are acting as values of a key, which are the names of those dictionaries. So second dict are the body of these two dictionaries here. So since second dict represents the body of these dictionaries, it itself is a dictionary. That is why after I printed out first key, which will represent the name of those dictionaries, for the nested for loop, you can see that I'm also applying dot items on second dict, because for every iteration of second dict is itself a dictionary. So for the first iteration, so what you will get here is that for the first iteration, first dict would represent hold one, and second dict would represent this dictionary. And then this will print out first key, hold one, then this nested for loop for its first iteration, sec one would represent name, and sec two will represent Jerry to print out second key, name, second value Jerry, and to start its second iteration. That is for the nested for loop. Now for the second iteration, second key will be age, second value will be 31. To do that till it gets to course and biology. Now, after it gets to course and biology, before the outside for loop would now move to its own next iteration, then it will repeat the whole process again. But of course, we're not going to write our code like this. We're going to be able to specify when we are about leaving the first iteration of the outside for loop, just like what we have done for our previous programs. So you come here and create the topic dictionary, in a dictionary. So I will create a dictionary. I'll call it main one is equal to. Now, first one will be um, I'll just give them people's names. Maybe James. James. I'll just say course and maybe physics. Then maybe school. Maybe Oxford. All right. Then for the next dictionary, I'll just come and say Alex. Now say course, the same thing. Course, call it biology. And then the next one, school, call it Harvard. Now, I'm sure we get the picture. Picture is pretty clear. We can see that James is a dictionary and Alex is a dictionary. Dictionary name to be specific. James is a dictionary name, Alex is a dictionary name. The the body of those dictionaries are the values of those keys. So James and Alex, they are keys, they are dictionary names, and then their actual elements are acting as the values of those keys respectively. So now I'll come here, create a for loop. I'll say for data one, comma data two, main one, main one dot items. Now I can create a conditional statement to tell me when I am about leaving the first dictionary to the next one. So I will just come here and say if data one is equivalent to James, what am I trying to do? So I'll create a for loop. A for loop, I'll say IT1. Now don't forget that data 2 itself is also a dictionary. IT2 in data 2 dot items. So what will I do? I'll come and say print. Now before I even say print, before we do that, you just come here and specify first nested dictionary print dash dash. So first nested dictionary. All right, you can come here and now say print. Just say key, the same thing, pretty much the same thing, dot format IT1. Then you can come here and say print value dot format IT2. Then you can come here and create another conditional statement. Tell if data1 is equivalent to what's the second person's name rather, Alex. So Alex. Now instead of wasting your time, now remember, in order to make this thing neat, you have to create a new line after you are done iterating over the first dictionary. Say print backslash n, and you can just come here and copy your code to save yourself the stress of repeating code. So paste. So you can just come here and say second nested dictionary and to give our code order. So if you run it, you will discover that it will print out exactly what we expected it to do. Now, we also want to print out the name of the dictionary as we are. So when we printed out first dictionary, we can just give it a name here. First dictionary dot format. Now you just come here and say data one. Then you can just do the same thing here. So second dictionary dot format data one as well. So that we get the name. So why are we doing this? So that for each iteration of the outside for loop, we will be able to see the name of the dictionary at that point in time. So you can see that we have first nested dictionary James, then we have the key and value pairs inside that dictionary. Then we have a new line, then it shows us second nested dictionary Alex, then we have its respective key value pairs. I hope we got that. So If you didn't really get this tutorial, please message me, send me a message in the comment section, and I would do well to respond to you. So that brings us to the end of this episode of this our Python tutorial series. If you are enjoying this tutorial so far, please hit the like button, please share my content for me, and please subscribe, because without your subscription, without your shares, without your likes, I might not be encouraged to do more videos. So with your love and your support, it's going to encourage me to be able to make more beautiful content for you. So until now, thanks for your audience, and until we meet again, have a very great day.